Here we are again. Welcome to Delivered, where we are delivering mothers, midwives, and magic. We are here for January, which is Cervical Cancer Awareness Month. We decided to make that a big part of this podcast so we can make sure that we are sharing lots of information, lots of options, and sharing some stories. I think that's really important too. I am Jaszmyne.
I'm Sherry.
I'm Erica. And welcome to Delivered again. Talking about cervical cancer and this month of January, where we're talking about this awareness that we want to have. When we think of cervical cancer, of course, we think about the female body, right? We were
Mhm.
just talking about that. And the biggest thing around cervical cancer is like, why does this matter? Why should we have awareness around cervical cancer?
When you think of cancer, most people think of lung cancer or breast cancer. Cervical cancer doesn't really come up because it's silent. The symptoms are interesting. It's important to get checked because if you don't get checked and you wait too long, just like any other cancer, it can spread. It can spread to your ovaries, it can spread to your uterus. So it's all about awareness and early detection and treatment.
And I think what you said, it is kind of silent. I think as humans that identify as women who have female reproductive organs, you go in and you do this yearly exam. It's this PAP, and you probably don't even get a call because you're like, it's this thing I did. It's normal, I hope. You get a call if it's not. I think everything's so downplayed. We were talking about that
Mhm.
before the video on how a lot of this women's health, and I think the awareness because of the HPV piece, right?
Mhm.
Because you can't have cervical cancer without having HPV. So if you have
Exactly.
HPV, you're at a higher risk. Jaszmyne earlier brought up such a good point, and maybe she could talk about that piece about how we really focus on this female anatomy being the issue.
Yeah.
And what did you learn, Jaszmyne?
More men have HPV than women. And I have statistics actually. Let me take a look.
This is
Let me
really
bring up
interesting
my
because I'm going to admit something. Before and we're sitting here talking, and I said, "Oh, the statistic for men is going to be negligible."
Mm,
I was wrong.
I agree with you. In my ignorance, I'm like, yeah, of course, more females have HPV than men. In 2013 and 2014, 45.2% of men aged 18 to 59 in the United States had genital HPV compared to 39.9% of women. So we are thinking about HPV as something that is tested mostly in women, right? And with this pap smear that we're talking about, but we're not the ones who have it at a higher rate.
We need a shift in paradigm because obviously it really isn't a female issue. But like a lot of things,
yeah.
the onus has been put on the female gender.
Mhm.
But
Or
that's mind blowing.
since we are midwives, we talk about pregnancy a lot. We talk about pregnancy and the fact that the person with the female reproductive organs is carrying the baby. All the responsibility is put on that person. While research shows that almost everything that has to do with this baby that's being carried is the man. It is affecting it, or the person who
Mhm.
I don't know how to say this correctly. I'm so
The human, the
the
human
with the male sex organ, the one
with the penis, the
who
person with the
is
penis.
who is responsible for what? Preeclampsia for babies, what else? I know preeclampsia is one that is definitely affected by the person who's not pregnant. And so all of these things, of course, the person with the female reproductive organ is carrying the baby, so all of the responsibility is put on her, while it's really the other person is what makes up the anatomy of baby and all of the things that can matter, right?
Mhm.
So I think it's the same when we're talking about HPV because we know that men can have HPV as well
And
at
HPV
higher
is an
rate.
STI, which I think kind of gets lost. That is an STI, which I think needs to kind of be talked about
Mhm.
because
We were talking earlier. I remember going to a workshop. We were talking where you could detect HPV in the blood. And so when we were talking about this, I was like, I thought there was a time like 10 years ago, we were thinking the pap smear was not a relevant way to test
Mhm.
for cervical health, I guess. And in our homework and stuff, we're looking at, and I guess we're going to cover how it's tested, but I think the men, like I have pregnant humans come into my office and go, I just found out that my partner's stepping out on me. I need an STI panel.
Okay.
And so in my brain, I can't help but think like women are going for annual exams. Why in our society are men not going?
Oh, that's a whole other episode,
No,
Sherry.
I think right now,
Okay.
it feels relevant
Because
because if a man knew he had HPV, then he could practice
safe sex.
safe sex and divulge to his
But men don't
partners.
want to practice safe sex because of wearing a condom. That's really
Well,
the
I think
safest way to
some men
avoid
want to.
maybe.
And then
And then it's
probably,
awareness. So that's what we're talking about. Why does this matter?
but
This
if a man
matters.
divulges, hey, I have this STI, they're less likely to have sex. So yeah, they don't
I
want to
think
know
men
their
are
status.
gonna
Why does it matter? To me, it matters because I've loved ones in my life who've been diagnosed positive for HPV and it came through their part. For me, I think it matters, this awareness, so that women can protect themselves and advocate for themselves.
I agree.
When it comes to that sexual interaction, because it's not contracted through blood, right? It's contracted through skin to skin contact, meaning intercourse in general. That there's where the spread of HPV is, because cervical cancer doesn't exist without that HPV piece. And so I think that's why it matters, is it's a conversation that every human walking the planet, this affects everybody. So we have to care about everybody. So I think my confusion about the blood test was, it said HPV cervical cancer related cancers. So it's not specific to that, but Erica was talking earlier about how much ovarian, uterine, cervical, how they all kind of fall into this. And I
It's the
think
female plumbing system, for
it
lack of
feels
better
a
description.
little dismissed, a little like it's not that important. Whereas I think,
Right.
I think breast cancer, they got a great advocate under them and pink became their thing. And, but there are so many different cancers that are worth talking about, knowing about from a health standpoint. So you know what to look for, how to advocate for yourself.
Well, okay. So here's the thing. So when we screen for cervical cancer, there are different things that we look for. So there's in situ 1, in situ 2, in situ 3, and those are usually signs of what's called dysplasia. I know a lot about this because I am a cervical cancer survivor. I was diagnosed with cervical cancer right before my 30th birthday. I am turning 60 this year.
We're very glad she's still here.
I'm really glad I'm still here too. Female cancer runs in my family. My mother passed away in 1970 something of ovarian cancer. And by the time she was diagnosed, she was basically a dead man walking. I think early screening is important. I remember the very first pap I ever got. It was abnormal. I was showing signs at age
how old you were?
16.
Yeah.
16. Not sexually active. I had not had intercourse at 16, but I had abnormal squamous cells in situ. That's something else to think about. Young woman, not sexually active, and yet there's abnormalities in her pap. I can tell you, I never had a normal pap smear, ever. I think one time I did, and I questioned it.
And so at 16,
it was 1.
And then you never had another abnormal?
Oh, no. Every single one was abnormal.
You said you had a normal one. And you questioned it.
One normal pap. I was in my early 20s, and I was like, that's not right. I made them redo it. I was like, that's definitely not right. I was living in Boston, and they redid it, and I got a phone call. Yeah, you have an abnormality, but don't worry about it. 14 years later, I had just had my second baby. I was one of these people who wanted to have like 6 kids. I wanted to have a big family. I was always envious. Like, Sherry has all these kids. There's some other midwives who have like 5 or 6 kids, and one of my clients has like 5 or 6 kids. That was always something I wanted. That was not in the cards for me. I got a phone call. My doctor said, I need you to come in. When a doctor says they need you to come in to talk about lab results, it's never a good thing. So I remember we were living in the DC area. I called my husband. I was like, you need to come home from work. The doctor needs us to come in. And I remember when she sat there and she was like, "So you have cancer." And I just kind of sat there and I looked at her. My poor husband, he started to get upset and have a meltdown. I remember I just looked at him and went, mm-mm, mm-mm, no meltdowns. And so I asked,
Well, it's heavy. Even you saying it right now, it feels heavy, even though you
Mhm.
survived it. And just saying you have cancer is
"It
it's
is
really,
big,"
really the big thing.
but I wouldn't let it. I was like, "Nope, I'm not doing this." And I made the decision. I was like, "I am not doing this." Did I go through some treatments? Yes. Did they work? No. So I opted to have a radical hysterectomy right before my 30th birthday. Actually, I think it was on my 30th birthday.
Can you explain what a radical hysterectomy
Okay, so a regular hysterectomy is they just take your ovaries out and your tube. A radical hysterectomy is they take everything. So I have no ovaries, I have no uterine tube, I have no uterus, I have no cervix. I got nothing in there. I did go back every 3 months to have a PAP done for probably 3 years just to make sure everything was normal. I was lucky because a lot of women are not as lucky as I am. My mother was not lucky. She died at age 41. She left behind me and my brother. And I made a decision. Nope, that's not going to be me.
Don't you think if you didn't have that experience,
Ah,
you might have continued the treatments until it was too late?
probably.
But because you had had the experience with your mom, you were like, I'm not going to risk it. I remember when Angelina Jolie, do you remember this? Angelina Jolie was at risk for some kind of cancer and she did a radical surgery for it. And I felt like everybody judged her like, oh my gosh, why would you just jump to that piece? And in my brain, I thought, well, sometimes you feel this instinct
Well,
that you have to
I
do that. So
know.
what made you go, this, I have to go all
Oh, I can tell you, it was my kids. That
Mhm.
easy. I mean, it was my kids because there was no way I was going to do to my kids what my mother did to me. And I know my mother, look, she didn't do anything. I know that. But in my mind, I was like, oh no, because that would mean I would have to come back and haunt the crap out of my husband. I had made the decision. I wrote out my will. The night before my surgery, I wrote out my last will and testament. I divided up all of my stuff and my jewelry and I gave it to my husband. He was like, "What is this?" And I was like, "Just in case, I need you to hang on to this." There was also a letter in there to him basically saying, "If I die and if you get remarried, you better do it the right way.
Pick someone who loves my kid.
Don't me." And that's all I'm going to say because I'm not going to that kind of stuff here. But yeah, if you're going to get remarried, you better remarry someone who is going to love my kids fiercely.
Can you walk us through what did recovery look like? Can you walk us through?
Oh, yeah.
Like you go in, is it an in and out procedure
No,
or you're
I was in the
admitted?
hospital. Okay, think of a C-section, right? Think of a cesarean.
Yeah.
I have a C-section. I have that scar. They basically opened me up, and I like to say, which is probably not very, gentle or nice, but they scooped me out like a cantaloupe. They took everything they could.
Did you feel it? Can I ask you a question?
Yeah,
Did you miss it?
no, the
It
opposite.
felt better. You
I
felt
felt better.
lighter.
I felt better. I will say that for a couple of years, and I still every once in a while will get phantom cramps because there's nothing in there to cramp. But every once in a while I'll be like, oh, that's weird. Why do I feel like that? The recovery I remember was longer than a C-section. My husband was working and we decided we would move out to a tiny little town in Virginia that had a single stoplight. And that's where I did my recovery in this farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, which was probably the worst decision we ever made. That's what we did. But it was long. I would say I didn't really feel fully recovered for probably a good 2 months.
Yeah.
I did go on hormone
I
replacement
wanted to ask
therapy.
about that.
I didn't like the way it made me feel, so I stopped. My doctor was not happy and kept saying, I need you to do this. Otherwise, you're going to your hormones are going to be out of whack. Well, I thought my hormones were out of whack on the hormone replacement therapy. So I stopped. For me, that was the right decision. I'm not saying that's the right decision for other women out there
Sure.
who have undergone a hysterectomy.
Because a lot of times they'll even leave the ovaries just because the hormonal piece gets so discombobulated.
My problem was that my ovaries were a mess.
Well, I'm not
So,
saying you should, but I know
right.
that when they're looking,
Yeah.
and that's why you're saying radical, some people keep that there because the hormone piece,
Mhm.
because not only do you have like that cancer piece,
Yeah.
that major surgery piece, but you have this also regulated some of my
Mhm.
hormones.
Yeah. I didn't have that. I had to have everything taken. And that's because the history, a lot of times it's familial history.
My grandmother had ovarian cancer, and I went into my gynecologist and told them, I think I'm supposed to be, the rule of thumb with pap smears, you get them, you're supposed to get your first one when you become sexually active, right? I can't tell you how many clients of mine come in pregnant and have never had one.
That is,
We could talk about awareness for pap smears or just a wellness exam. We
Mhm.
kind of talked about how
Right.
important just a wellness exam
Mhm.
is. I went to them and I said, my grandmother had ovarian cancer. She didn't die from ovarian cancer. She died from lung cancer. But I think I'm supposed to come in more because that rule of thumb of every year. But then once you're over 30, you can spread them out every like 3 years, especially if you have the same partner. I was like, I don't think I'm supposed to do that because of my family history. My physician said, that's not how it plays out. You're actually not at higher risk.
It's
I-
so funny because even on our intake form, that family history is a big part. The pregnancy and how it plays out and all these other things, even in just a regular GP's office, like they want to know that history.
And that being said, my mother, and I can't remember how old she was, but they found masses in her uterus. My mother comes from that generation where they didn't share it about themselves. It was all private. We heard from a friend that her mother was having a hysterectomy because they found a mass. My mom didn't call us. So me and my sisters flew in for the surgery and took care of her. But she had everything removed too because of this mass. It wasn't cancerous. But in my brain, I went, okay, my grandmother had ovarian cancer. My mother had a hysterectomy. And now I have symptoms of polyps, heavy cycles, but I'm also menopausal. My doctors kind of go, you should just take it all out. And here's me with my experience, right? I'm scared because my mother and grandmother, they went pretty cuckoo. I'm nervous about that hormonal piece. I see why you did it. And if I had lost my mom to that mass,
That may have been your experience too, what you wanted to.
but after talking to you, does it make me feel more diligent? I do pap smears every year. I mean, it's so accessible to us because I have people here who could do it at any time.
Mhm.
But I think that's where the awareness comes from. I
Yeah.
think sometimes things are glossed over because, like she said, you can do a pap smear, have squamous cells, and we say, we're just going to keep an eye on it.
Keep an eye on
See you in 6 months, and we're going to just keep an eye on this. So talk a little bit about like, what is cervical cancer? What is HPV?
It's a virus. Well, HPV
Yeah.
is a virus.
Yep.
And viruses, when they go unchecked, they can turn into different things.
Because HPV stands for what? Human papilloma.
Human
virus.
papillomavirus.
Yes,
Right,
human
yeah.
papillomavirus.
And viruses never leave, right?
Right.
So that stays.
Which is probably why I never had a normal pap. I don't know how I would have contracted HPV as a non-sexually active teenager.
To be fair, we haven't really been talking about HPV. When did we start talking about HPV? Maybe 20 years ago.
And I was already an old lady.
Yeah.
Well, I remember being screened for HPV when I was a teenager. So yeah, about 20 years ago.
We used to also
thing,
not test for
actually.
GBS.
This is
But I knew babies that got sick from GBS. We weren't regularly screening for GBS.
Right. We've learned more about our bodies and those humans who have female reproductive organs. We've learned more about what could go wrong. It's a complicated system in there. Like our reproductive system, it's complicated. The fact that we can maintain a pregnancy is kind of outrageous if you think about it.
If we're talking about cervical cancer, we're also talking about HPV because, like you
Mhm.
said, you don't have cervical cancer without HPV. So
But if you have
definitely-
HPV, you're at a higher risk.
Right.
It's a risk factor. Other risk factors.
Oh,
Talk about
heavy vaginal bleeding is a
Mhm.
risk factor if you're a cigarette smoker.
Don't take up smoking.
Yeah, smoking
That's
is
bad.
So thank you.
Drugs are bad.
What? I guess what she said.
Drugs are really bad.
Here's a risk factor that I didn't know about cervical cancer
Okay.
is that women living with HIV are 6 times more likely to develop cervical cancer.
The statistic I read before we started filming, I didn't know this. So you are also at a higher risk of developing cervical cancer if you've had multiple
Oh, yeah.
pregnancies. Okay. I did not know that.
Do you guys think that might have anything to do with the technology
Exposure.
that's used, like when we're thinking about
What is everything being
hospital
exposed to?
versus how much we're being touched and how much our cervix is being poked and prodded when we're having these babies or when we're enduring these pregnancies? All the things that are happening inside of and around the cervix when we are
Mhm.
carrying children.
I guess I would have to want to delve into that. Is it that exposure? Like, there's so many things we don't know about, right? What does that do for us? We know that if it takes the cell of an animal and you put the cell separates and comes back together, and everyone kind of lost their minds. And then we were like, well, the human cell is more complex.
Right.
But, and even a physician said to me, why do your clients not want scans? He'd be like, it's just like standing next to a speaker at a rock concert. I'd be like, well, if I'm growing a kidney that day, maybe I don't want to be doing there. I don't know the rules, right? But I think we don't know, we don't learn until years down the road what worked and didn't work. It's just
Right.
working now.
Right.
Right. And so I think, there are things that we have done where we go, we shouldn't have done that. That caused more of a problem than it helps.
Well, just by saying that, it makes me think of amniocentesis. Just
Huh.
remember once upon a time, like I remember when I was a kid and my stepmother was pregnant, and you didn't have a baby unless you got an amniocentesis. Like that was something that was done.
When I first started practicing,
Super
we still
invasive.
offered it. I had some clients who did it because
But we don't
we
do
were
that
starting doing
anymore.
triple screens and quad screens when I got started in this. We didn't have cell-free DNA screening. And so people were doing amniocentesis is because after that triple screen or quad screen, that was the next
That was
step.
the next thing. But what they found
Glad
was
that
that
could have been
it was
risk,
you
but we
were at
don't
a
know.
greater risk of miscarrying.
Yeah.
Well, those are the things that happen when you put a big old needle into some lady's belly.
Not to mention, it's got to be, I don't know about the multiple pregnancy thing, but it's got to be like because we know there's hormones in the foods and stuff that we eat, and whether that plays a factor. We know that like little girls now go through puberty sooner than like our generation. I had a woman in my office recently who started her period when she was 9.
Yeah.
My youngest daughter did when she was 9. 9 years old.
I was not thinking about
I see, but
anything about it.
that to me is epidemiology.
Can you talk about that? But that's not a time.
Epidemiology is the study of communities and the effects of the environment on the community. That's epidemiology.
Oh, yeah. I've heard
I
it
do
called
too.
epigenetics.
That's probably
Those are risk factors.
and
I
what
think talking about-
socioeconomic groups are at a greater risk,
Well,
which is a whole other thing.
But is
here
that
too.
more about access to care, access to prevention?
I think it's access to care. I think it's also where you're living, how you're living, the foods you're eating.
I had an Australian client I was talking to once. In Australia, sun exposure is big. They have free clinics. You can walk into a free clinic and they will do a full body skin scan for free because they understand skin cancer has to be caught and detected early.
They also have different medical systems.
Here, I paid $250 for them to do an upper body scan, and then I have to pay for another appointment for a lower body scan.
Mhm.
And so I think about our system, and I wonder
broken.
in these socioeconomical groups,
Mhm.
because sometimes people come to me like, oh, there's all these systems in place. And I'm like, you're just speaking to me as a middle class or a upper middle class human who has resources. And so I think that that's important. And I think
Well, and
the
that's
fact
the other,
that
that's
men don't take
important
responsibility.
only because when screening for cervical cancer, ovarian cancer, or uterine cancer, women in a higher socioeconomic bracket are more likely to be screened
That's what I was-
rather than women in a lower income bracket who don't have health insurance, don't have access to a vehicle to get to a clinic. A lot of families who are in a lower socioeconomic bracket don't have vehicles. They have to navigate a public transit system, which makes it that much harder to get to their
Vegas
appointments.
doesn't have a great
Oh, Vegas has a
public
terrible
transit
transit system.
through the grant system. Our clients were getting lifts and Ubers, but the first thing the government runs out of are those vouchers.
Yeah.
It was
Which
the
is
first thing, and we used
disgusting
like
to
3
me.
of them or something.
Yeah.
We used like 3 of them, and those vouchers were gone.
I think access
were you
and
gonna
I
say?
think
Yeah.
trust when we're
Yeah.
talking about socioeconomic factors, because the people who are in a lower socioeconomic class are mostly Black and brown people, do not trust
Yes.
white coats.
And why would they?
Indigenous people.
Why would
Because
they?
Yeah.
they've been
Because
sterilized.
they've been given no reason to trust.
Mhm. Yeah.
So that's a big one. I would agree with
So
that.
yeah, I think it has to
100%.
do with trust too. I'm
But
sure that
that's the
there's
reason
so
why
many
I like
other
to offer
factors.
home visits.
Yeah.
We should throw in my RV, go around.
I would love to
Because
have
you
that.
could do, okay, so
Well woman visit.
and let's talk about like well woman for just a second. So like when someone comes in for a well woman care and they want to be tested, if you want to be tested for HPV, our understanding is after we look through this, you can find HPV related cancers through blood work, but it
Mhm.
really is cultures. So it's through a pap smear
Mhm.
or an aptima test, which is just a glorified little Q-tip. It's just about getting the cells from the right place, because these Q-tips or brooms or spatulas or
Yeah.
whatever we're using, we're going and we're collecting those cells. So we're collecting cervical cells and we're sending that to a lab, and they're telling us what those cells look like under a microscope. That essentially is how that test can be done.
That's
Okay.
it.
We should just load it all up in my RV and go out and
Knock on doors.
pap smear everybody. Jaszmyne.
We knock on doors for
No, Jaszmyne. Bring up how it's detected in men.
what?
The test for men.
Oh, my test for men. So what's so important about cervical cancer, what we've talked about is that you can't have it without HPV. And HPV is not just something that people with female reproductive organs get. People with male reproductive organs get this as well, right? And so we are doing our research and we're like, well, how are men tested? How do we how do we find this
I don't
out?
deal with men, but I want to.
And
I want to.
so
I want to take care of the whole thing.
so we're not just gonna service the females. And I found out that although a blood test cannot detect human papillomavirus, there are other tests that can. And one is called an anal pap smear. Okay. This pap
No, that
smear screens for dysplasia and anal cancer in men who have a higher risk of developing anal cancer. This HPV part that can lead to cervical cancer also leads to anal cancer in men, which is why we need to have this awareness. We're going to go in the RV.
I'll do the men for free. Do the men for free.
Knock on doors. We're going to offer these pap smears and these anal pap smears too.
Oh, you're a bunch of
nights out there on just protecting the people. You know, my mother was a nurse, so I got a pap smear at 16. Adam and I are married for a long time, and something starts happening with his reproductive thing. So he has to go in and have his prostate checked. So he comes home and he goes, I am never going in for a prostate exam ever again. That was humiliating. That was so horrible. And I just was like, oh my gosh.
I mean, is that what men get? Is a prostate exam an anal pap smear? Like,
Have
it
you
has to
never,
be different,
have you
right?
never had?
They stick their finger in there.
That's the prostate exam.
No, I've had OBs do that to me. You've never had an OB do it to you.
No.
The
I
very
think you
first
got-
exam. The very first exam I ever got with my mother in the room. 16 years old on this table getting my first pap smear. My mom's in the room. He stuck his finger in my ass.
Did he tell you?
No. It was shocking. It was shocking. I felt so violated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that men are kind of like, I don't want to do that. And for women, it's just this accepted standard.
But
how we're treated for
That goes
child
back
and
to
taken
how
care of.
women are treated in the medical setting.
That's what my mind went to first when Sherry's asking this question of, well, why are we doing this pap smear instead of just pulling blood like we were talking about, or just a urine test? Because that's one of the ways in my research it says as well,
point,
is
good
that
point.
HPV can be detected. So why aren't we doing these things? My mind goes to because they hate women. That's what runs through my mind. We're not
important.
in the medical system, in media, in
See,
so many different ways.
Not to bring up religion, but in Judaism, women are held to a higher standard. God looks at women as above men.
Mm.
I say that only because in our community, it's the opposite. Like, we are second, third, and fourth class citizens. All we are good for is having babies and cooking in the kitchen.
Well, it's always driven me crazy, this idea of going, well, we're so much better, right? When it comes to racism, sexism, all those things, I go, "Oh, we're so much better." And in my brain, I go, better than what? Because it's still not where it should be, or it's not even close to where it should be. So why are we just focusing on where we got better? Let's keep focusing on the problem so we can do better. Because if you say it's so much better than it used to be, you're disqualifying it as something that needs to happen. You're saying, we've improved it. It doesn't need any more attention.
Mhm.
And what
Yeah,
I think
right.
we're saying in awareness is, it doesn't matter if we've improved it. It's still not where it needs to be.
Mhm.
And all the
Well, but
things
that
coming
also
out
brings
saying
me
they're
to the
not doing
vaccine.
studies on women.
That brings me to the vaccine. So we were talking about this before because, full transparency, I'm not a supporter of the HPV vaccine. That being said, you really need to do your due diligence, do your research, and decide if it's the right thing for you to do.
With literally anything.
Obvious.
Literally anything. But
I think this is one of the worst vaccines out there. I don't think there's enough known about it. I don't think there have been enough studies done. So that's my 2 cents on that. But I think
Do you think it's because it's not gender specific and they
Probably,
don't kind of
yeah.
know what to do
Oh,
with
yeah.
it? I feel like with the vaccine, because it is kind of catered to the female body, and that's what they're addressing with it, instead of looking at a general human vaccine, because they're only doing it to young girls.
Mhm. Well, but think about it. This kind of goes back to what we were saying before, is that our medical system belittles women.
we're
Which-
going to talk so much more
We're gonna talk
about
more about
this
it.
in our next episode. We're going to be talking about the symptoms, diagnosis, and treatments. When we talk about cervical cancer, we have to talk about HPV as well. We're going to talk about that more.
I mean, the vaccine piece. And I want to
Yeah.
say, we did look up the National Cervical Cancer Coalition has a
Mhm.
lot of information about the vaccine, about early screening,
Mhm.
where you can get support, symptoms and signs to look for. I know we just covered just a
Also
moment of
recently.
this, and we
And
want
I
to
will
address
say,
next week, but this is a good place to
they
go.
how breast cancer has their pink ribbon, cervical cancer has a teal ribbon. The organization to donate to is called Teal Toes. If you want to make a donation for cervical cancer research, they don't advertise. It's really kind of on the low key,
Say it
down
again.
low.
Say it one more.
Teal Toes.
Should've worn
TEALTOES.
maybe next
And
time.
the color of the ribbon is teal blue, or
We
it
should all
kind of
wear
looks like
silver
Tiffany
toes.
blue.
So, because
Next
we still
episode.
got so much more to
Yeah.
dive into to research, and we really want to hear from you guys too. So, if you've had someone you know who has had cervical cancer, who has dealt with that, and maybe you were there with them, or if you just have questions, we want to know so we can address it in our next episode too. And my biggest thing is just around STIs or anything. Make a plan, right? Like make a plan so that you can get screened and so that you can feel comfortable and empowered in your body.
And parents educate themselves so that they can actually educate their children
Mhm.
at a
Yeah.
young age for that early detection
Yeah.
and developing a healthy plan moving forward, I think.
Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. This has been Delivered.
Follow us on Spotify or YouTube.